All right, the drug class. Woo! Hey, this is a public service announcement on psychiatric meds, and if you happen to be enrolled in addictive and compulsive behaviors, you may benefit from listening to this lecture. I'm having quite a few computer problems. This is actually the 7th time I've tried to record this information, so I apologize if it doesn't sound as riveting as it might have sounded the first time through. We're going to focus on the antipsychotic meds and mood modulators. We'll save the anxiolytics, the anxiety drugs, for the next lecture. Bottom line is there's a tacit assumption that we've got a biomedical model of mental illness, and you probably won't be stunned to learn I'm not a big fan of it. Biology is probably not destiny, although we are bodies, at least in some sense, and the biological functioning does contribute. So we're going to take a look at the impact of these various medications, their rather unimpressive alteration of chemical functioning and relief of symptoms for some situations, and rather important, helpful impact in others, and basically get a feel for different psychiatric meds so you would know them if you heard them. If you happen to be on a psychiatric med, this is not medical advice. Believe me, everybody is different. This is such an idiographic thing. So if you've got mental illness symptoms and you're on a medication, please don't just decide to change it after listening to this lecture. Talk to a mental health professional or, God forbid, even an MD. Well, what is the evidence for the biomedical model of mental illness? Generally, we either get these arguments related to brain structure, like, oh, hey, their brains look different, or brain function, hey, the way their brains function seems to be different, and that's associated at least with these various symptoms. Or there's the chemical imbalance model, which was beaten into all of us in the 1970s and seems to be the unfalsifiable notion that somehow the way your neurotransmitters squirt is different from the way people who are happy all the time have their neurotransmitters squirt. Obviously, this is an oversimplification and, truth be told, kind of inane. Nevertheless, we do have some data that are consistent with the idea that there are at least biological contributors to some of these diagnoses. What are those data? Well, first and foremost, we gather evidence from concordance rates. What does concordance mean? People going together. So if folks have genetic overlap because they're close relatives and the frequency of the disorder tends to covary as well, that's at least consistent with the idea that there's a genetic and potentially biological contributor. And then the other big thing, particularly with schizophrenia, is people jump up and down a lot about the notion that there are comparable incidents in diverse cultures and societies. So at least in first world countries where prenatal care is reasonable, pretty much all of those countries and societies have a base rate of schizophrenia of just under 1%. It's an intriguing way to make the argument that, wow, this must be in some sense a biological issue rather than just a product of societal or personality features. With that in mind, let's look at this illustrative example. This is only an example, but actually, if you look at large samples, this does seem to replicate. These are MRIs, these are brain scans from two male identical twins, one of whom happens to be schizophrenic. And if you had to take a wild guess, what a surprise. The guy on the right, the guy with the larger holes in his brain, the guy with the bigger ventricles, happens to be the one who also qualifies for the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the one with more brain structure, in fact, has the advantage and seems to be buffered against it. Now, how could they possibly have brains so disparate if they're genetic identical twins? Truth be told, the onslaught of various birth complications seems to be the source of these kinds of deviations. So I'm not saying it's true in this case, but often one child ends up getting yanked out with the forceps, or one child ends up unable to get as much oxygen during the birth process as another one, and that stressor alone, in combination with genetic risk for schizophrenia, seems to be an important contributor. And that essentially is what's underlying my friend Sarnoff-Mendik's model of schizophrenia that has to do with what he's calling diathesis stress. So the genetic risk is literally the diathesis, and the stressors are things like birth complications. He also identified another stressor, flu, getting the flu during the second trimester. If your mom gets the flu during the second trimester of your development, that's a stressor that's also something that can combine with the genetic risk for schizophrenia to increase your risk for schizophrenia. So we don't really think of stressors that early in life, but in fact, the data are consistent with that. There was a lot of mommy blaming when Sarnoff first started gathering these data. I don't think that was intention, not that he's not kind of a sexist anyway, but really it was that essentially he stuck with the moms because when he did the blood tests on children and moms, he discovered the blood tests from the dads suggested there was really no way that they could be the dads. So I'm not saying schizophrenic women cheat on their husbands, just everybody seems to live the lives they live and choose the partners they choose. And he couldn't trust the data on who was the dad as well as who was the mom because she was right there literally delivering the child. Well, with that in mind, here's a graph from Irv Gottesman basically suggesting that as the amount of genes folks share increases, so does the probability of having schizophrenia if the proband, if the target person is also a schizophrenic. So let's take a look at this box down the right. What you can see here in the red is identical twins share literally 100% of their genes. First degree relatives, in the long run, on the average, share about 50% of their genes. Right? Not everybody is exactly that. Second degree relatives, your cousins and half siblings. I'm sorry, not your cousins. Your nephews, your grandchildren, your half siblings, they share about 25%. And then third degree relatives, your first cousins, share about 12.5% of the genes. And then as we look down the left-hand side here, what we see is essentially if we've got a proband who's got schizophrenia, what's the probability that that person's relative has schizophrenia as well? And you can see here with identical twins, it's about 45%. And it works its way down with less genetic overlap. So fraternal twins, children, siblings, parents, etc. In the general population, it's literally only 1% now. So an identical twin of a schizophrenic literally has almost a 40% higher risk, basically, of getting schizophrenia. This really does support the genetic component. There are some data suggesting that having a psychotic in the family does increase creativity, loose thinking, and we'll talk about when we get into the various symptoms of the disorder, but I should tell the story of my dad's Aunt Laura. My dad comes home one day, he's 10 years old. My great Aunt Laura says, "Bobby, you never have to go to school again." And my dad is thinking, "Woohoo, this is wonderful." And then she said, "'Cause I'm the Messiah." Right? And as soon as he sort of heard this delusional belief, he realized, oh man, this is not quite the invitation to time away from school I had hoped for. I'm not pretending this is evidence that I am necessarily creative so much as trying to offer a genetic explanation for my own deviance. Well, with this in mind, let's take a look at the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia, and I want to just not get too lost in the DSM-5 diagnoses as give you a general feel when you're trying to decide which person you want to sit next to on the bus, for example, what kind of interesting conversations you're going to have. Also, that these symptoms tend to factor analyze into two factors, if you will. There's sort of a positive symptom set and a negative symptom set. The positive is not necessarily positive in a, ooh, this is a wonderful thing, but that it's an additional thing, something added to your usual functioning. And these include delusional thinking and hallucinations. Right? Let's draw the distinction between these two. Delusions tend to be a general belief in something that clearly could not be true. Right? And obviously some of these vary across cultures and eras, but a delusional thought is more than just me thinking, hey, I'm 50 sit-ups from being a babe. right? A delusion is often, hey, there are cats flying around in outer space trying to send me secret messages into my thoughts, and if I just wear this aluminum foil hat, they won't get in there anymore, right? That's pretty unlikely, right? Now, if it were dogs, that would be different, but that would be a delusion if you think cats are doing that. In contrast to hallucinations, where delusions are really thoughts, hallucinations are a sensory experience, right? And they're almost always, at least in the psychotic disorders in humans, auditory, right? You think you're hearing a voice inside your head telling you various things. Often it's the content of your delusional thoughts, which is certainly intriguing. I know in the Hollywood movies, hallucinations are often visual. Visual hallucinations are incredibly rare unless you're on a hallucinogen, but that's a separate issue. Right? So think about delusions and hallucinations as the positive symptom set, and then the negative symptom set tends to be really the absence of things. So less affect, less emotion in general, less expressiveness on that, and a less motivation to just get motoring, to just sort of do things for reasons that we're still hypothesizing about. So dulled emotions, literally, you don't seem to be able to tell if these people feel these things with the same magnitude as others or not. My friend Frank Weathers showed a bunch of psychotic people really scary scenes and really moving scenes and really happy scenes from various video clips, and then looked at their physiological reactions. They seem to be limited. The expression of emotion seems to be impaired as well. So you guys know I lived in the halfway house Blair House at Bloomington, Indiana. One of the clients there, Kevin, I love this guy, but his father died and he was really sad, and I think he really was really sad, but when he said it, it was not particularly persuasive. We do see also inappropriate verbal expressions, so you see essentially the way that they talk seems to be at odds with our standards for what is appropriate verbal communication. So we'll see clanging, basically words that rhyme or loosely associate end up showing up in their conversations more. Another client at Blair House, Richard, was when those anti-gravity boots were really hip, where you hang upside down from a chin-up bar. And I said, hey, Richard, you should give this a try, man. It'll stretch out your back. And then when you finished, he stood up and I said, hey, man, you're like a half-inch taller. And he said, oh, Mitch, I'm tall. I want to go to the mall, but I'm short-minded, right? Now, obviously, being tall and going to the mall don't often go together in most folks' appropriate verbal expressions. And then that switch from tall to short seems like an odd, loose association. And these kinds of things are typical of folks with the psychotic disorders. And as you can imagine, this does seem to account for some of the intriguing notions with creativity, but that literature is another can of worms, shall we say. Catatonia is just, there's a subset of folks who literally seem to have these motor problems where they'll just stand in a certain position, maybe arms extended or one arm over their head or something like that, and just hold that strange position for hours on end. And it does in some ways certainly look deviant, but maybe say something about, what's going on inside their minds is markedly more dramatic than what we're accustomed to, and so they don't even notice that some of these body positions are deviant or potentially even uncomfortable. Now, not all schizophrenics display all of these symptoms. Nevertheless, trying to do subgroups has been an uphill battle, shall we say. We do get replications on the notion of paranoid schizophrenic. So there's a subset of folks who have delusions of persecution, literally. They think that other folks are really out to get them and that everybody's intentions are malicious. That often replicates across rather large data sets. So, essentially assuming the worst of all people. Truth be told, because of the stigma associated with the disorder and some of the deviant behaviors they show, it's not completely insane. And I want to emphasize that, the guys I lived with at the halfway house often did get hassled because they were so odd. And, I was in Indiana. It was not necessarily a land of everybody being completely tolerant of deviation, shall we say. Well, with that in mind, here I've got an item called just which of these has the highest concordance rate? Do we have identical twins, fraternal twins, or Siamese twins? Siamese twins is no longer PC. They are conjoined, and truth be told, they're could be fraternal or identical, but they just happen to have their bodies overlapping. That was just a ploy, just a distractor item. It's the identical twins who share 100% of the genetic loading, whereas fraternal twins in the long run on the average share only half. And why is this relevant? This is part of our argument for biological contributors to the psychotic disorders. Well, with that in mind, I've got the cover of a book titled Schizophrenia, and it has the person's head depicted as different puzzle pieces, and some of the pieces are missing. And the take-home message here is just I want to draw the distinction between schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder, a completely different set of issues. Schizophrenia, unfortunately, is the roots in Greek basically mean split mind, but they should be considered a translation of shattered mind. It's as if your mind has fallen into pieces. The attentional capacity is awry. In an effort to try to make sense of the world, you end up, doing the best you can, but you have these novel and not necessarily adaptive thoughts and these wild experiences. It's not like multiple personality disorder where we generally see folks, usually in response to trauma, function as best they can with one identity, if you will, one set of memories, one set of skills, and in other circumstances, another set of memories, another set of skills. Multiple personality disorder is a completely different diagnosis. This was really problematic in television, in the 1970s or so, but I do feel like folks are getting this, but definitely do not confuse schizophrenia for multiple personality disorder. Oh, and I've got a slide here just showing this poor guy. The bartender's asking him, saying, I repeat for the fourth time, which kind of beer would you like? And the poor guy's got all these beer names showing up in his head. And when I lived at the halfway house, a lot of the patients, God bless them, so particularly if they had had a lot of caffeine, they would say, this is very much like their experience. So I know the psychedelics are often said, this is a psychotomimetic, this is what it's like to be psychotic. They said no. And even the ones I knew who had done psychedelics said no, because you've got an attribution, you've got a drug that you can blame it on. It's much more like this in that you cannot filter out the stimuli that are available. For some reason, you have everything coming in all at once, and it's hard to focus on any one thing. And in fact, the laboratory tasks are consistent with this idea. It's a tough way to live. I gotta tip my hat to folks who make any progress with the psychotic disorders. Well, our best efforts have been to try to find any kind of substance that could help alleviate these symptoms. We've categorized these antipsychotics basically in accordance with when they were discovered. So we've got a first generation, second generation, third generation antipsychotic meds. They're also known as neuroleptics. But what we're going to see is throughout all of them, there's a lot of support for the notion that they all depend upon the neurotransmitter dopamine. Looks like an overactive dopamine system contributes to particularly the positive symptoms of psychosis. And with that in mind, then we want to notice that the drugs that are most serious blockers of dopamine function are also the ones that seem to have the most widespread and intense efficacy for battling the psychotic disorders. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to try to save this file now in hopes of making it so I actually succeed here and don't have to give this lecture 10 more times to myself in my tub.